quite understood how much things have shifted in certain circles on this question, where there's some people who are still think that it's like an absurd idea. And there's other people that are just like, yeah, it's perfectly sensible. And these people will like come out of that pipeline: Harvard, Rogoff, intelligence community, PhD.
Today we're diving into a fascinating conversation from the TFTC podcast with Matt Pines, a geopolitical analyst who brings a unique perspective on how major institutions are changing their views on Bitcoin. Matt's background in national security and his current role advising various government agencies gives him valuable insight into how powerful organizations are thinking about Bitcoin behind closed doors. In this video, we'll explore how central banks are reacting to Bitcoin, why they feel threatened by it, and how some of the smartest minds from Harvard and the intelligence community are starting to see Bitcoin as a serious part of the future financial system. If you're interested in understanding how Bitcoin is being viewed by the people who run our financial system, you're in the right place. Before we jump in, hit the like button if you enjoy this kind of content, and subscribe to catch more clips from the TFTC podcast. You can find the full episode linked in the description below. First up, we're going to hear about how two major central banks, the European Central Bank and the Minneapolis Federal Reserve, have recently published papers about Bitcoin. These papers reveal how threatened these institutions feel by Bitcoin's existence. Let's take a listen. A paper that I was cited in and commented on, which was the European Central Bank's paper about Bitcoin and why people who don't have Bitcoin should avoid it and try to make it illegal. Obviously, the Minneapolis Fed, maybe not obviously, but the Minneapolis Fed came out with a paper not too long after, singing a similar tune, a bit different, but saying that Bitcoin is a risk to our ability to debase the currency and go into as much debt as possible. Maybe we should cut off the exit ramps for individuals and corral Bitcoin into the government so that we can continue to issue debt. So what just happened here? Two of the world's most powerful central banks published papers basically admitting they're scared of Bitcoin. Why? Because Bitcoin makes it harder for them to create money out of thin air and go into debt. Think of it like this. Central banks want to be able to print money whenever they want, but Bitcoin has a fixed supply that no one can change. The more people who buy and hold Bitcoin, the less power these banks have. That's why they're suggesting we should make it illegal or find ways to force people to avoid it. They're telling on themselves here. They're openly saying Bitcoin threatens their ability to control money. Next up, we're going to hear about a more practical approach to Bitcoin adoption, one that doesn't try to ban it, but instead embraces it in a measured way. Listen to this. Simple things like, all right, capital gains tax is gone. You can spend Bitcoin and use it as a savings account. We're going to let the banks hold Bitcoin. And yeah, we'll put some Bitcoin in the treasury as well, but not set off the arms race with other geopolitical players that see you can accumulate 4 million Bitcoin first. And if you're not thinking forward, I mean, you should probably be looking at what is actually happening. And actually, the timing of this conversation is pretty incredible considering what we talked about earlier this summer. That conversation was highly focused on this arms race around AI and energy. Let me break this down. I'm describing a middle ground approach for how governments could adopt Bitcoin instead of trying to accumulate massive amounts of Bitcoin all at once, which could cause other countries to panic and start their own buying sprees. We could take smaller steps, remove taxes when people spend Bitcoin, let banks safely store it for customers, and maybe put a small amount in the national treasury. This would help Bitcoin grow naturally without causing international panic. The timing of this discussion is interesting because it connects to bigger conversations about technology races between countries, especially around artificial intelligence and energy. Now we're going to hear about how Bitcoin is being taken seriously by some really impressive people in Washington. Check this out.
David Zell, Grant McCarty, these guys have, turned that sort of YOLO idea into like a legit think tank now. We have like 20 plus fellows. Going to be 2025 is going to be a big year for BPI. Really, scaling up a lot of the activities. But we just put out a white paper by he's actually an economist in the intelligence community named Matthew Ferranti. And the title of the paper is "The Case for Bitcoin as a Strategic Reserve Asset." And it's like, it's a decent report, and it goes down kind of like the checklist of different features of Bitcoin that, allow it to serve this role as a global reserve asset for central banks, for example. And it's kind of crazy to have like a guy who's a PhD from Harvard. His advisor, I think, was Ken Rogoff, who's like,
NERP,
yeah,
the NERP guy.
yeah. And so he's comes out of the full institutional framework, right, piped into the intelligence community, and he's just, makes perfect sense to have Bitcoin alongside gold as part of your sovereign reserve portfolio.
What Matt's describing here is pretty incredible. There's this group called BP that started as a kind of wild idea, but has turned into a serious think tank with real intellectual firepower. They just published a paper making the case for why countries should hold Bitcoin in their reserves, just like they hold gold. But here's the amazing part. This paper wasn't written by some Bitcoin fanatic. It was written by a Harvard-trained economist who works in the intelligence community. His old professor, Ken Rogoff, is famous for being really negative about Bitcoin. So to have someone from that world saying Bitcoin makes sense as a reserve asset, that's a big deal. Here's a fascinating look at how attitudes toward Bitcoin are changing in powerful institutions. Listen to this.
So it's like, I think people haven't quite understood how much things have shifted in certain circles on this question, where there's some people who are still think that it's like an absurd idea. And there's other people that are just like, yeah, it's perfectly sensible. And these people will like come out of that pipeline, Harvard, Rogoff, intelligence community, PhD, like they're there. And I think this is the trajectory. This is the part where we're in this weird zone of uncertainty, or, where some people's Overton window has moved pretty wide. Others is still very narrow. And I think that's like creating a lot of interesting dynamics inside DC, where a lot of the traditional tropes about how people approach Bitcoin were kind of just embedded as like, oh, like you sneer at it, you make fun of it, it's not a serious thing. And then you all of a sudden have people that are very serious people be like, oh, this is a serious thing. And that kind of like, for that like managerial technocrat that like prides themselves on like having a domain of expertise and control, that they know the left and right corners of their field and their domains of responsibility. And that
we've just heard how attitudes toward Bitcoin are shifting dramatically in some of the world's most powerful institutions, from central banks showing their fear to intelligence agencies, considering it as a strategic asset. It's clear that Bitcoin is being taken more seriously than ever before. What do you think about these changing attitudes? Do you believe central banks are right to be worried about Bitcoin? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this breakdown, you can find the full conversation on the TFTC podcast, link in the description. Hit the like button if you found this helpful, and subscribe for more insights from the world of Bitcoin. Thanks for watching.